Hong Kong descends into chaos, or maybe parties, and why the Chinese regime wants to be friends with Nicaragua. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The situation in Hong Kong is getting out of control, at least according to the Chinese Communist Party. It makes sense. If the party gradually steals away Hong Kongers' freedoms without anyone noticing, everything is going according to plan. If people stand up for themselves, the situation is totally out of control. And obviously, the best way to bring it under control is for Beijing to get involved in some unspecified but threatening manner. A senior Chinese official in charge of Hong Kong affairs warned that Beijing would intervene if the local government proved unable to contain the violent protests. He said the protests have clear characteristics of a color revolution. So let's check in on those violent protests. Okay, that looks less like a color revolution and more like a colorful laser show. And sing-along, which turned into a dance-off. Hey, it's friend of the show Tom Grundy, editor-in-chief of Hong Kong Free Press. That violent protest was in response to the arrest of a university student. Plainclothes police arrested him for what they called buying an offensive weapon. That weapon was a laser pointer. Protesters have used laser pointers to disrupt police cameras. The fear is that police will later identify protesters and arrest them for rioting. Those fears are justified. The city of Hong Kong has been in turmoil for 2 months. It's because of the Chinese Communist Party's attempts to gradually remove Hong Kong's democracy and freedom. Protests in Hong Kong have been heating up. Earlier this week, protesters lit a bonfire outside a Hong Kong police station. Police responded with tear gas, and one protester responded with a Molotov cocktail. The most offensive kind of cocktail. Well, after an espresso martini. This week also saw 1,000 lawyers taking to the streets in protest. That's the second time lawyers have marched in the streets since June. So many lawyers. That truly is terrifying. And it's not just lawyers. Over the last 2 months, there have also been protests from mothers, retirees, aviation workers, government employees, and bankers. Yes, the bankers are out on the streets. This truly is chaos. On Monday, there was also a general strike and protests throughout the city, despite Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam's warning that protesters were going down a path of no return. During the strike, Hong Kong police fired 800 canisters of tear gas in one day, which was impressive since they had only shot 1,000 tear gas canisters in the previous 2 months combined. I'm old enough to remember when police firing 150 tear gas canisters in a day was a record. That was less than 2 months ago. On the plus side, these protests have been a boon for the tear gas industry. And if you're wondering why some protests seem to end in tear gas and others end in dance parties, I have noticed it seems to depend on whether or not the police show up. Interesting. But the situation in Hong Kong will only get worse. Protesters are already calling for another protest this weekend, and they're using lightsabers as a play on laser pointers. Meaning now, Hong Kong protesters will face their greatest enemy yet, a copyright lawsuit from Disney. And coming up after the break, I sit down with a political activist from Nicaragua to learn how the Chinese Communist Party wants to pull the country away from Taiwan. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. So, I interviewed my first terrorist. At least that's what the dictator of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, calls him. At the Oslo Freedom Forum, I sat down with Felix Maradiaga. He's an academic and political activist in Nicaragua. Back in September 2018, he spoke at the UN Security Council about how the Ortega regime brutally represses Nicaragua's people. Afterwards, the Ortega regime issued a warrant for Maradiaga's arrest. They accused him of organized crime and financing terrorism. Right. In fact, Maradiaga was attacked by a mob of 50 Ortega supporters and had to be hospitalized. Now, I'm betting a lot of you watching probably don't know much about the situation in Nicaragua. The country rarely makes it into the U.S. news. But there is one country that really cares about Nicaragua, and that's China. The Chinese Communist Party has its fingerprints all over Nicaragua, and Felix Maradiaga joined me in Oslo to give me the rundown. Thank you for joining us today, Felix.
Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. So, for those watching who don't really know much about Nicaragua, can you tell us what the political situation is like there?
It's very complex at this point. The Daniel Ortega regime has closed any possibility for peaceful protest. There are about 400 people in prison just for exercising their constitutional rights of protest. Basically, we live in a police state.
But isn't he a president? Doesn't that mean it's a democracy?
Well, that's the problem with dictatorships. I call them dictatorships 2.0 because they have been able, many of them, to bend the rules which have been developed for democracy to pretend they are democratic regimes. Daniel Ortega came to power in 2007 again due to a very strange reform in the Constitution that allowed him to be elected. But in any case, in 2011, he was reelected against the Constitution. So our argument, as we have presented to the Organization of American States, is that he is not a legitimate president under our Constitution.
Well, I coined a term that I used to describe the leader of China. Not quite a president, not quite a dictator, a presitator. So if you'd like to use presitator to describe Ortega, I'm perfectly happy with you.
I think it works perfectly. And that should be a red flag for democracies around the world. I like to use the painful situation of Nicaragua to make a case for democracies around the world. That when democracies do not really deliver what the average citizen wants, it opens a door, an opportunity for authoritarian regimes to emerge.
Well, so what's China's role in Nicaragua?
The situation in Nicaragua is quite strange in terms of the relationship with China. Nicaragua is one of the very few countries around the world that actually has diplomatic relationship with Taiwan, not with China. On the other hand, at the political level, it's well known that Nicaragua has ties with China. And in fact, the flagship project, as Daniel Ortega argues, in terms of foreign investment, it's a canal that is supposed to connect both of the oceans, and that is not an investment from Taiwan, but actually from China, which once again is strange because we do not have, as a country, a formal relationship with the People's Republic of China. It is clearly a move by the Chinese regime as well, because a project of such size could not be pursued without the support of the Chinese government. They're using at this point a company registered in Hong Kong to pursue the project.
So you think China might be trying to woo Nicaragua to abandon Taiwan in favor of
I think that ideologically that has been a long-term project of the Sandinista party. You know, ideologically, the Sandinista party and China, they've always had a lot in common. When democracy was reestablished in Nicaragua in 1990, during the 16 years of democratic transition that we had, Nicaragua developed a close relationship with Taiwan. But I have to say that unfortunately, even Taiwan, at least in relationship with Nicaragua, has behaved in a very unfortunate way, in the sense that Taiwan, despite many requests, is one of the very few countries that continues to openly support the Daniel Ortega regime. So we're seeing China and Taiwan competing for Daniel Ortega's attention.
How is the Sandinista party ideologically aligned with China? Well,
as you know, the Sandinista party emerged as a classical Marxist party in the 1960s, and in 1979 it became a successful political military movement that defeated the dictatorship of Somoza. Now the new version of the Sandinista party that came back into power under Daniel Ortega in 2007 continues to have the rhetoric of Marxism and socialism, but in practice it's a very pragmatic regime. It's just one more authoritarian regime that will use rhetoric on one side just to attract allies, but will basically use any tools, any ally to pursue its objectives.
Well, interesting you say that, because I know the sort of Marxist or communist rhetoric is often used in Latin America, where there's a lot of promises made, but it always seems to end in authoritarianism. Why does that line of reasoning still keep getting used?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question, but I think that a big component of that line, as you clearly define it, is that there's sort of romanticism, utopia of socialism being closely tied to egalitarian principles. And we have to be very candid in saying that Latin America has been one of the most unequal regions of the world. There is a big issue of poverty. There is a big issue of class struggle in Latin America, and of course, the narrative of Marxism continues to be very compelling at the narrative level. But in practice, it's a system of dominance that doesn't really provide freedoms for the individuals. And in countries where levels of education are so low, that type of populistic rhetoric becomes really dangerous. So I think that in the case of Nicaragua, as in many other underdeveloped parts of the world, the only tool to fight that kind of lines is through education. When people are well informed and when people have the basic tools to pursue employment and health and basic rights, populism and particularly Marxism doesn't have any chances. So it's basically, in Latin America, is still a fertile ecosystem for this type of narratives because of our inequality and low levels of education.
Well, so with the Nicaragua Canal, I know that seems to have stopped, correct?
Yes, we have seen that many of the initial parts of the project, such as, for example, the environmental impact studies, the meteorological studies as well, and some other engineering studies, they have been stopped at all. Many environmental activists argued from the very beginning when the project was first mentioned about 5 years ago, is that this project was never an authentic, legitimate investment. It was always a project that had something fishy. For example, money laundering. For example, something that is quite clear, a project designed to basically take away land from indigenous communities and from the farmers and the campesino communities of Nicaragua. In fact, what we see today in Nicaragua, it's closely connected to what is known as the campesino movement, which are the landowners that mobilized in 2013, 2014 against the Chinese project. This movement that emerged as a land rights movement is closely connected to the peaceful protests that we see in Nicaragua today.
So the Chinese investment in the canal, that didn't do anything to benefit the people of Nicaragua?
No, not at all, not at all. And if you read the law that was approved in record time, so it took a very few hours to approve one of the most strange laws in terms of investments. The canal law has been elevated to the rank of a constitutional law in order to create almost a state within a state. So let's assume that the project will evolve. Basically, the canal area would have been outside of the tax authorities of Nicaragua. It would be outside of the judicial authorities of Nicaragua. So clearly, the Daniel Ortega regime was trying to develop something with the Chinese that went beyond a normal investment. And the landowners actually perceived that as that's the reason why they mobilized. This project never benefited Nicaraguans. It actually affected and destroyed many of the environmental areas of our country.
Well, now that it's been stopped, does that benefit the people of Nicaragua?
Well, the people of Nicaragua has always said that we are a country that has open arms to foreign investment as long as these investments are clean, are legitimate, are under the rule of law, are based on the principles of fair trade and free markets. That's what the Nicaraguan people believe. I mean, we are a country of entrepreneurs and a country that has suffered many wars, and we understand that investments are important. However, the experience with the Chinese has been very unfortunate. The way in which some teams of Chinese engineers have intervened in private property rights, the way in which the project has been developed with complete lack of transparency is something that raises a lot of flags. So as we have argued together with many environmental activists and grassroots leaders and local communities, is that the way that this project was designed, it's far from a project that could bring development to Nicaragua.
So is there concern about debt trap diplomacy?
Yes, and it's also a concern of a project that was designed as many other projects in Nicaragua that have been developed with Russian money, with Venezuelan money from either the period of Chavez or Nicolás Maduro. It's just another project to enrich a family, another project just to enrich an authoritarian regime that has amassed money as no other regimes in previous times. So it's not a project aimed at developing the country in terms of attracting employment and other types of clean investments.
Does China provide any military equipment or training?
As I said, Nicaragua is a country that does not have formal relationship with China. So at least officially, the Chinese are not working in terms of bringing official cooperation to the military or to the police. There are unofficial accounts, and we have strong suspicions that there are some relationships in terms, for example, of espionage and in terms of collaboration with the regime. But it has been very hard to actually document and prove those suspicions.
Okay. What about things like censorship and surveillance? I know there's been sort of a push for more internet censorship, more surveillance, facial recognition technology. Is any of that coming from China?
It's part of the conversation. In fact, prior to the Canal investment project coming into the public eye, there was discussion of a satellite of private investors from Hong Kong, which are closely connected to the same group of people who are investors around this very strange character, Mr. Wang Jing, who's based on independent media research, is someone who has been for years connected to the Chinese military. We have raised this issue to the international community, and it's quite sad that Nicaragua has not been able to attract international attention on what is happening in Nicaragua with the Chinese presence and with the Russian presence. That, just to make a comparison, when we first raised a flag about the Russians, very few people believed it, and now there is a very big Russian presence in Nicaragua. And it started just as the Chinese, just as rumors, as something that was not very easy to prove, and suddenly the Russian presence in Nicaragua is deeply ingrained in the political system. So we want to continue to insist that despite the fact that we're not seeing concrete Chinese presence in terms of massive investments or presence in terms of surveillance technology, it is something that is not far-fetched at all.
So this is something that could be a national security interest for the United States.
Absolutely.
And so you, as an opposition leader, how does all of this affect you?
Well, not only as an opposition leader, as a citizen, as a human rights defender. Many years ago, back in 2006, I published a paper called China's Side Principle. My argument at that time, based on reviewing many documents from China on how the Chinese government trains their military, their intelligence officials, their diplomats, is that China is not willing to face the United States directly, but through the sides, using what I would call the side principle. This was back in 2006, looking at the way that China is strengthening its presence at that time in countries such as Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Nicaragua was just part of that strategy. What really concerns me is the lack of attention that this issue has in Washington. I think that with all due respect, Washington experts on Latin America are probably too consumed and to focus on many other important issues. But China is a direct threat not only to the safety of citizens like myself who believe in free press and who believe in private property and who believe in human rights, but also to any other individual in the hemisphere who believes in democracy.
And this sort of lack of foresight on the part of Washington, that goes back several administrations. It's not just the Trump administration. It was Obama, Bush, Clinton. It's been going on a while.
It's been going a while, and what I believe, I mean, from the perspective of what we do in Nicaragua, I mean, in addition to my political and human rights work, we have been working for over 16 years in public policy, and we have developed several papers on this particular issue. And we have arrived to the conclusion that the Chinese mindset is a long-term mindset. I mean, China looks at public policy in terms of 50, 60, 70, even 100 years from now, you see? And the Western perspective is not only a U.S. problem, it's a problem of the West. We see a public policy in terms of presidential terms, you know? So it's important that those of us in the Western Hemisphere who believe in the fundamental principles of democracy, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and in general, the Declaration of Human Rights, need to understand that China is not a traditional threat from the perspective of the Cold War or anything like that, but it's a threat to freedom because China is supporting authoritarian movements and authoritarian regimes that actually threat the principles of the Western Hemisphere.
So what hope is there for people of a country like Nicaragua where their authoritarian dictator is being backed by an even more powerful authoritarian regime?
Well, our hope is that democracies around the world could work together and strengthen our common values, are also our common strategy in protecting human rights. In last year, September 5th, 2018, I was able to present the case of Nicaragua in front of the UN Security Council. It was very unfortunate that clearly, you know, Russia and China completely opposed to what we suggested at the UN Security Council when we presented that the issues that are happening in Nicaragua with the close ties of Ortega with Venezuela, with Russia and China are also a threat that is not only domestic or national in Nicaragua, but it's a threat to the stability of Central America. What we are seeing is a pattern in which authoritarian regimes around the world are closely working together. You see China and Russia collaborating. We have seen the presence of Iran in Latin America, very close to Nicaragua. We see Venezuela. And we expect that the democracies around the world, and particularly the United States, as the most solid democracy of the industrial world, actually take the leadership that is expected from the U.S.
Yeah. So it's hard to get support in the UN when Russia and China play such a large role.
Indeed, and that is a problem in which the UN system has been designed. Once again, it comes back to the basic principle of human rights. When farmers in Nicaragua have been displaced because of Chinese investments, when indigenous communities in Nicaragua are being displaced or threatened in their community rights because of the Chinese presence, these are not only problems related to local grassroots communities of Nicaragua. It's actually a threat to the stability of the region and to the fundamental principles that have been developed within the Western Hemisphere, particularly on the Democratic Charter of the OAS. This is something that we're also elevating to the OAS, and we are expecting the leadership of the U.S. also being present not only at the UN, but at the regional forums such as the OAS.
So what happens if China is left unopposed in Latin America?
I think that that's the same question, and not to exaggerate, it will be the same question that many people asked many decades ago when Germany was not seen as a problem during the first years of the Nazi regime. We have seen that when any authoritarian regime that has resources, power, global presence are left without a balance of power, democracies are challenged and human beings pay a huge price. So I hope that not only the United States but the world would understand that having such a massive global power that is not a democracy is a problem not only for my country, which is a small country in Central America, it's actually a problem for the world. Have we seen a case in which two major global powers can cooperate if one of those powers is not a democracy? I think that's the biggest question. This is not only an issue of Nicaragua, it's an issue for the global stability of Earth.
All right, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm glad that we spoke about something that is not very much addressed.
Unfortunately.
Once again, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, okay?
Absolutely.